So one way I've attempted to learn about children's capacities for education is to look at hunter-gatherers. I've never lived in a hunter-gatherer band myself, in a hunter-gatherer group myself, but I have a colleague at Boston College who lived for a cumulative total amount of about a year or two with a group called the FA in Africa, and she was telling me something about what she found there, and it got me really curious. And I ended up reading whatever I could about hunter-gatherer bands throughout the world, hunter-gatherer cultures throughout the world, and then from there I interviewed or surveyed, actually with a written survey and some follow-up interview, 10 fairly prominent anthropologists who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures in 3 different continents. Most of the research that they did was in the sort of second half of the 20th century. It's hard these days to even find any hunter-gatherer groups that have not been quite affected by modern cultures, but as late, certainly the second half of the 20th century, from about 1950 on to about 1980 or so, was the big time for anthropologists to go out and discover these cultures in isolated parts of the world that had very little contact, if any, with modern ways of living, and were still presumably living in ways that they would have been living prior to the advent of agriculture. What's interesting, and there are 2 or 3 dozen such cultures that have been well studied. There are more than that have been studied a little bit. And what's interesting is there are certain similarities among all of these cultures, such that anthropologists talk about hunter-gatherer band culture almost in the singular, even though all these cultures are different in many, many ways. They have different languages, different rituals, live in some in jungles, some in desert, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, there's certain similarities. The cultures, all of these cultures are not tribal cultures. Sometimes people make the mistake of calling them tribes, but these are band cultures. They live not in big tribes, they live in small bands. Each band is autonomous, although there's a network. They know people in other bands. The bands are maybe 20 to at most 50 people per band. They are nomadic in the sense that they move around from sort of campsite to campsite within a certain territory. And that means that they don't own much property. There's no point in owning more than you can easily carry on your back because you're always moving. It also means that you don't have any fixed place to keep stuff. So these are cultures where people don't have a lot of goods. And these are called, another term that anthropologists use for these cultures is egalitarian cultures. They are far and away the most egalitarian cultures that have ever been found. There's no such thing. They have no chief, they have no big man, they have no hierarchy of structure. They make all of their decisions by consensus, to the degree that they have to make decisions for their group, such as when are we going to move on, and so on. Are we going to have to develop a rule about this? Are we going to have to expel so-and-so from our group because becoming such a pain? All of these kinds of things they have to discuss. And they survive really by sharing. They don't have a way of long-term storing food. So the way you are absolutely dependent upon the fact that if you don't get any food that day, you don't kill an antelope, somebody else will. And everything is shared among everybody in the band. Part of their egalitarianism, and this is the part that I'm interested in, and I almost didn't believe it when my friend Gilda told me about it, but when I heard it from all these other anthropologists, I began to think there has to be something to it. Part of their egalitarian view is an extraordinary respect for individual autonomy. They don't believe it is proper to tell somebody else what to do. Even if you know better than somebody else and you see they're doing it wrong, you don't go and tell them a better way to do it, because that would be acting like you might find some way, some way of demonstrating it to us, some way by joking or something to help convey them, help them out. But you don't just go and say, this is how you should do it, because that would make it seem like you believe you're better than them in some sense. You don't really have a right to tell somebody else how they should do things or what they should do. Most amazingly, this applies to children as well. They don't believe it's right to tell children what to do, and they don't. Apparently, they don't tell children what to do. So this survey of anthropologists led me to three conclusions that I think are really significant regarding self-directed education. Remember, we were all hunter-gatherers until a mere 10,000 years or 11,000 years ago, and longer than that in most parts of the world. But agriculture first came into being in a few parts of the world about 10 or 11,000 years ago. That's a speck of time evolutionarily. So we evolved as human beings. Our brains, our ways of learning, our ways of thinking evolved under hunter-gatherer conditions, and many anthropologists at least believe that the conditions represented by these modern groups of band hunter-gatherers, egalitarian cultures, are probably at least the way a large number of our pre-agricultural ancestors lived, if not all of them. So the first conclusion that I drew from this study was that adults do not direct children's activities. I could read a list of about 10 or 15 quotations from different researchers on this, but let me just read three of them to get you a flavor of what they say. So here's one researcher, happened to be studying a group called the Paracana in South America, but who's talking here about hunter-gatherers in general. Hunter-gatherers do not give orders to their children. For example, no adult announces bedtime. At night, children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them, physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. That's the kind of thing I heard over and over from people. They don't praise, if you think about it. We kind of think praise is good, but criticism is bad or punishment is bad, but praise is really just the flip side, and so withholding praise is, if you're somebody who praises, the first time you withhold it, that's punishment, right? So they just make the assumption that their kids are going to be okay. They don't feel like they've got to try to direct their kids' behavior by praising what they want them to do or criticizing or punishing them for what they don't want to do. They just assume the kids are going to be okay. Here's another quote. The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the Yaquana vocabulary of behavior. This is another South American group, as it turns out. There is great interest in what everybody does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce anyone. The child's will is his motive force. I remember I talked about will as one of the basic drives. The hunter-gatherers were people who respected will. They thought that the development, the elaboration of your own will is really, really important, so they would not suppress the child's willfulness. And here's another example of a quote, this one for somebody who was studying the Inuit in the Hudson Bay area. Infants and young children are allowed to explore their environments to the limits of their physical capacities and with minimal interference from adults. Thus, if a child picks up a hazardous object, parents generally leave it to explore the dangers on its own. The child is presumed to know what it is doing. So my friend Gilda Morelli has slides of little toddlers, 2-year-olds, playing with machetes, playing with fire, adults not paying any attention to that in the background. And I asked her, well, don't they sometimes get hurt? Don't they sometimes cut themselves or burn themselves? And she said, yes, they do. But so they get a little cut or they get a little burn. And most people have, scars from childhood and from later on. But so I said, well, then why don't the parents stop them? And the answer that I got from her and other anthropologists basically was twofold. One is, well, that's what he wants to do. Why should I stop him? And secondly, that's how children learn. That's how else is he going to learn? He's got to learn how to use these tools. He's got to learn how to handle fire, how to handle knives. And I think implicitly they understand that the sooner you begin to play with these things, the more these will become extensions of your own body, the more skilled you will be with them. So historically, it wouldn't have made sense for them to stop their children from doing these things, because it's very important that they develop real skills at this. On the other hand, they are not negligent parents. They hide the poison darts way, way up high in a tree. That's something you would more than injure yourself with. So these are not, they just make different judgments about what's tragedy and what isn't. Poking yourself with a poison dart is tragedy. Burning yourself, cutting yourself, not tragedy. So that's the first conclusion, that they don't direct their children's activities. Second conclusion, children, including teenagers, have essentially unlimited time to play and explore. You know, before I began this research, I was kind of under the assumption that probably by the time you were 10 or something, you'd be working all the time. And it turns out that hunter-gatherer bands, nobody works very much. The average people who've done sort of studies of how much time the adults actually spend working, hunting and gathering and creating tools and so on, it amounts to about 20 hours a week in the typical hunter-gatherer band. And they also don't have this notion that it's work. And the way they preserve that notion is nobody has to do it. You will get food anyway. There are always people who want to go hunting. There are always people who are glad to go out gathering. There are always people to do that stuff. But keep in mind, basically the hunting-gathering way of life you know, obviously we can't go back to that because you need a very sparse population to do it. But all you're doing is harvesting. You're not planting, you're not cultivating, you're not weeding, you're not doing all that labor. You're just basically harvesting what nature produces. And even though it takes great skill to do this, especially the hunting aspect of it, but gathering too, to know where the root's hidden underground, it takes great skill, but it doesn't take a whole lot of labor, it doesn't take a lot of time. So you have to be good in order to do it. So children can't really contribute even if you wanted to. In some places they do a little bit of foraging, but they do it pretty much on their own. But you have to become skilled. So there's an understanding that you need this period of childhood and even adolescence for practicing stuff. And how do you practice stuff? You play and explore, and you become good enough. And eventually you're actually on your own initiative. Nobody's telling you have to. You're beginning to actually bring food into camp. So here's just a couple of quotations about one of our questions to these anthropologists was, how much time did the children in the culture that you observed have to explore? Here's just two quotes that pretty much represented what all of the anthropologists had to say. Both boys and girls had almost all day, every day, free to explore. And here's another who wrote, children were free to play nearly all the time. No one expected children to do serious work until they were in their late teens. So interestingly, and the other thing that I learned is that when we're talking about children, we're talking about kids from roughly age 4 to roughly age 16 or 17 or so. This is 4 years old is when hunter-gatherers generally, roughly around the age of 4, they generally find that children have what they would call common sense. That the children aren't going to get lost in the jungle, they're not going to pick up poisonous snakes, they're not going to do really dangerous things. They don't need to be watched directly by adults anymore. They can now go running off with the other kids, playing with other kids. On through, basically it's when you're married and have a kid of your own, sometimes even married girls who might be in their teens are still regarded as children, still playing with the other children even though they might be married. So it's not the case that, there's a kind of a myth that the teenage years are something new that we think of as still a developmental period. Certainly hunter-gatherers still thought of teenage years as a developmental period. Third lesson that I learned from this study of hunter-gatherers is that in their exploration and play, children acquire the knowledge and practice the skills that are essential for success in their culture. They play out the kinds of things that they need to learn. Not because anybody's telling them to, but just because they are drawn to. So one of our survey questions was to ask the anthropologists, when you saw kids playing, what are some of the things that they played at? And by looking at what they listed to play at, we could see that they mapped pretty well on to the skills, in many cases, not in every case, but in many cases, to the kinds of skills that they indeed had to learn to become a competent adult in the culture in which they developed. So here's just a partial list of skills. Of course, these varied from culture to culture, but here are some skills that were mentioned by at least one, if not more than one, anthropologist. So, digging up tubers, fishing, smoking porcupines out of holes, cooking, caring for infants, climbing trees, building vine ladders, building huts, using knives and other tools, making tools, carrying heavy loads, building rafts, making fires, defending against attacks from pretend predators, which would be a way of practicing how to defend from real predators, imitating animals, which would be a way of practicing identification of animals, making music, dancing, storytelling. All of these cultures are rich artistic cultures in some ways, and they play at these things. And interestingly, several of the anthropologists talked about playful arguing as the play. So think of it, if you're growing up in a culture where decisions are made by consensus, the ability to present your view in a convincing way without getting other people mad is a very important ability. And some of the anthropologists described ways that they saw children playing at that. All of the respondents said that the boys played endlessly at hunting and tracking. Hunting and tracking are extraordinarily skilled tasks, especially tracking. And they are able to track animals over great distances based on just little marks in the sand or bent blades of grass. They can figure out what kind of animal this is, often which sex it is, what time of day it went by, whether it's worth pursuing or not, how large it is. There's a whole book written about by a South African in which he argues that tracking is the origin of science in human beings. All of what we call science is involved in tracking, including you're bringing data to bear, but you're developing hypotheses, you're testing the hypotheses, you're discussing the hypotheses with your colleagues, and so on. And so children are constantly, especially the boys, are constantly practicing tracking. They track one another. They track the adults. There's no such thing as privacy in a hunter-gatherer culture because you can be tracked by anybody. And they are tracking, and they're tracking little animals and becoming very skilled at them. They're also playing with bows and arrows or blowpipes and darts or whatever it is the weapon of their culture for hunting, and developing great skill at doing that. The one culture in which women as well as men hunt, the Agda, that was included in the group of cultures that we studied in this, not surprisingly in that culture, the girls also played endlessly at tracking and hunting. So apparently, if you are growing up in a hunter-gatherer culture, you look around, you see what the adults are doing, particularly what the adults of my sex are doing, and you play at those activities until you become good at them. So, so this was presumably, if anthropologists are correct, the way that children became educated for hundreds of thousands of years. It was a way, the other thing, let me say, is anthropologist after anthropologist told me, I never have seen a happier, more well-behaved, in the sense of truly well-behaved, conscientious people than the children in the culture that I studied. I once asked Gilda, because I had given a talk about hunter-gatherers, and somebody in the audience who was a graduate student was studying whining, and she was interested in how hunter-gatherer children whine. And so I said that I've never, all of this is here, and I've never heard anybody talk about whining, so let me check. So I asked Gilda, what does FA babe F.A. children's whining sound like? And she thought for a little while, and she said, you know, of all the time I lived there, I don't think I ever heard a child whine.